Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Same question as always. What's the hardest change you've been through in your life?
Morning, Gareth. Thanks for inviting me. What's the hardest change I've been through? Actually, lots of the changes in my life haven't been that hard. Um, I've tended to sort of follow my intuition with most of them. So, to France initially, then to Spain was very much. They feel like big changes, but they weren't hard changes, right? And I was quite lucky in the sense that I landed in Spain at a time where it was relatively easy to get a job. Even if you didn't speak Spanish, you could become an English teacher, which is what I did. And it was sort of really a time of boom in Spain. So you felt like you could. There were opportunities around enough, and particularly in Madrid, I think, which is a city that seems to absorb foreigners and absorb differences. And even the Spanish people who live in Madrid, not really from Madrid at all. They're from everywhere else in Spain, and so there's this kind of feeling in this city where everyone is from here and no one's from here at the same time. And so I think that created a real opportunity to kind of settle in. But anyway, so I suppose reflecting on the hardest changes, the one thing I sort of keep coming back to is when you have to fire people. Um, that never gets any easier. It doesn't matter how many times you do it. It doesn't matter whether the reasons you do it are, uh, well, they're always the right reasons, if you see what I mean. But that never gets any easier. And I think that's right, that it shouldn't get easier. It's an awful thing to have to do. And that's the one thing that kind of kept coming back into my mind as I was thinking about it. It's really, that I can't it never gets easier. I don't want it to get easier because you're dealing with people's lives and livelihoods, and people have families to look after, and it's right that that decision should be done in the most tactful and smooth way possible. But so that's kind of, I guess that's the hardest thing I still struggle with.
I think you say that it doesn't get any easier, but do you think you, I'm trying to think, do you get better at it? Is that the question? Or do you have more or less empathy when you have to go into those conversations? Because you're absolutely right. You go into a conversation like that and it's hard, and often the person is, well, sometimes they're expecting it, sometimes they're not. But
Yeah,
do you have you changed the way you deal with those conversations, having done so?
I think is certainly once you've had to do it in a difficult way, you become, I think, very much more focused on things like trial periods, and you become much more um, attached to the legality of things rather than the emotional of it. Perhaps that helps, but again, it depends if you have to do it because of restructuring or structural reasons within a business, or whether it is a performance related thing. Those are two very, very different things. And often where it's related with performance, it is easier in a way, um, because the rest of your colleagues thank you for having done it.
Yeah.
But there's still people affected, and it is hard. And you try your best to obviously to take everyone on a journey, and you have to kind of recognize there is some element of failure of leadership in that. Um, so I suppose you get more efficient at it maybe rather than better, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you certainly become more empathetic to the rest of the team. That you are actually solving a problem for potentially. So
I think that
um,
that failure of leadership is an interesting point. I've talked about this example before, but I've often, when I was working in the hotels, and the chef would come to me one day before a chef's probation period was up and was like, I want to get rid of him. I'm like, well, hold on a minute. He's been here for 6 months minus a day. Uh, and now, does he know that he's not performing? No, 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 no. It's just the end of his probation. He hasn't passed his probation. Okay, right. It's you definitely got to look at what you've done wrong as well as perhaps moving that person on. So, but yeah, it is incredibly tough. Um, tough. I was obviously researching this episode, and you've done so much. Trying to condense it into into some questions was quite tough, and I kind of wrote it in a bit of an order, but I'm going to pick something out that I'll put towards the end because I think it's a good starting point for a conversation about everything you've done. Is when I look at all the things you've done, and we'll come on to them around theatre, around teaching, bookshops, everything else. The one thing that sticks out more than any other is student housing, which is kind of
Yeah.
been your career for the majority. When I look at it, it's been the majority of your career, and yet you have all these creative pursuits outside of that. And I wonder how the two sort of fit together, and what almost what your priorities are in life, because from a time point of view, you've got a role to fulfill, and that's great. But yeah, it sort of there's all these pursuits over here, and then you've got student housing. So
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I have discussed this with my therapist at times as well. I have a pie, right? And then each of these activities is a proportion of the pie, and the way to kind of achieve happiness is balancing the different bits of the pie and so on. And I thought that's a really interesting theory. And when I achieve it, I'll come back on and tell you how I did it. I definitely haven't done it yet. My answer back to her was just make a bigger pie, but apparently that's not how it works. So, so I got into student housing by accident. So I mentioned that I moved to Madrid. I moved to Madrid in 2001, and I didn't speak Spanish. And so, like everyone at that time that didn't speak Spanish, we all went to become English teachers. And skipping ahead a little bit, my girlfriend, I hate saying girlfriend, I'm not married, and so it's kind of, anyway, you get the point, doing a course, and I was in the theatre doing, on a Friday evening, running the theatre company, and I was getting phone calls from London. I ignored the first one, and then they kept ringing, and I thought, oh God, she's in the hospital, something's happened. And picked up the phone from the sort of back of the theatre, and I was trying not to try to keep it. And I'm from a student housing company. We're looking to start a business in Spain, and we wanted to pick somebody's brains about how to work in Spain. And it was the HR director of the student housing company at the time, and she got my number from Brian Welsh, who you've already spoken to. And he got my number because, and this is how I remember it anyway, he'd looked on LinkedIn and basically put, right, who do I know in Spain? And he'd had some contacts from International House Newcastle that I knew because I worked for International House Madrid. And so he just emailed, anyway. So I get this phone call. I'm like, yeah, okay, but I'm in the theatre. So we met up, and we met on a very rainy day in Madrid, which isn't normal, and we came to Galdos, which is where I am now, actually, curiously, and we sat here, and they hadn't acquired the building by then. This was the first time that international capital came into PBSA in Spain. So this was 2003 capital management's first sort of push into that, and I ended up in the boardroom, which was just behind me, essentially being the translator for the HR director with the sell side on this whole bunch of stuff around collective bargaining agreements and so on. I was like, I only came to meet you for a coffee. And so this went on for about an hour and a half, and I'm thinking I really ought to get back to work. And as we were walking out, she looked at me, she said, if that doesn't convince you to come and work for us, nothing will. I thought, okay, this has gone really weird this day. And then shortly afterwards, I met Brian, and we had a few glasses of wine, and the rest is history. So that's how I got into it. What I really love about what's the link, although it's real estate, it's still university. And I've always wanted to be a university professor. I think that was kind of like what my, um, I sort of loved that university lifestyle, and I always thought that would be a great thing to be. But never had really the time or chance to go and do a PhD, to go to follow the academic path. It just wasn't what was destined at the time. Might do it next. Maybe that is the, don't want to skip ahead to your last question, but maybe that's what it is. And so I sort of always found that the atmosphere of working in student housing, certainly in Spain at the time, and was much more collegiate, in the sense of you were working with the universities in a collaborative way. You were working with the teachers, you were working with the students in a very deep or pastoral care role that I'm not sure is the same in PBSA in every country. In Germany, I think it's more of a transactional role. I think in America, they really don't talk to the management staff in the buildings and so on very much. It's, again, very transactional. This is where I live and that's it. That's not the case here in Spain. In Spain, it's very, very intensely, you're very intensely engaged with the students and the wider educational community. So I think that's kind of how I bridged that in my head. I'm not really a real estate guy. I think that's changed as my career has progressed. I think now when somebody asks me what I do, I say I'm in real estate rather than education. So perhaps that's been the change.
So going right back to, so you grew up in South Wales, and then went on to study languages. And I'm always interested to know where that love of languages came from.
Yeah. So the love of languages, I guess, came from the fact that I did speak Welsh as I was growing up. My family's not a Welsh-speaking family, but I went to Welsh-speaking schools. So until I was about 8, I was bilingual in Welsh, and then when my parents remarried, my stepfather is English, and so that was out now. That part of it was out of the question then. So no, we moved to a different village and went to an English speaking school. So I stopped speaking Welsh pretty much then. But it's sort of ingrained in you, I think, psychologically, but also, I think physiologically, as far as I know, the kind of neurons that allow you to kind of code switch between one language and another are formed in those formative years. And I think that stuck with me, even though I didn't speak Welsh anymore. And then my father tells this story of coming back from the Alps when I was sort of about 4 years old or something like that. And we were on the ferry just arriving into Dover. And I'm sort of pointing down at the quayside, and there was some policemen there, and I'm going, Daddy, look, a gendarme. And he's going, a what? And I'd forgotten the word for policeman in English. Apparently, this is the story I'm told. So that was kind of like, I was always sort of relatively good at French at school and so on. And actually, I was completely convinced that my father could speak French perfectly. Because every time we'd go to the Alps and he'd, order fondue and order, get the skis and all of this, hire the skis, he could do accent. And I was like, this is amazing. This is something to aspire to be able to speak fluently the language. And the blinkers didn't fall from my eyes until the day that I got married to a French woman. And I was sort of introducing my father to the sort of extended family, and I said, "Oh, yeah, this is my wife's grandmother. Just have a chat with her." And he looked at me and he said, "What?" And I said, "Would you just chat to her? She's lovely." And he went, "I can't speak French." And my stepmother kind of looked at me and she went, "But you can't speak French, don't you?" And I said, "No." And she's like, so my father sort of had this sort of fake it till you make it kind of, thing that, so I suppose that that probably accounts for some of my career choices as well. So I think it started very, very young and continued. And then while I was at sixth form college, I was kind of told I wouldn't get the grades to do law, and I really should play to my strengths, and so I did French.
So, as you alluded to, you moved to Spain and became an English language teacher, and you didn't speak Spanish. Now, I always talk to people about tough changes. That must have been, and you alluded to that, that must have been a tough change arriving in a country where you couldn't speak the language yet. You know, had to teach Spanish children, I assume, or adults, I don't know, English.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a tough change in some ways. I suppose there were a few things that were tough about it. It was the day after 9/11. That was pretty tough. Flying, the safety and security at the airport, Luton Airport. The day after 9/11 was pretty tough. And this was back in the days where you wanted to save as much money as possible, right? You couldn't afford to do anything, and so you got the earliest flight possible, which was the cheapest one, and I slept at the airport with all my stuff. I was moving to Spain, and so that was a bit of an adventure. But as I landed, I had like 3 or 4 different text messages offering interviews as English language teachers, but it was a real boom time for that industry, and so it was really easy to find a job in essentially an environment where everybody was English speaking, and your job was to teach them English. Now, it was a mixture of adults and children. I started mostly teaching adults in a business context. Then I moved into later teaching children and so on. But yeah, it was mostly adults. So the wider kind of context in Madrid is it's a relatively easy city to not speak Spanish in if you want to. That wasn't the approach I took. I lived in a kind of neighborhood which was very local, and I would kind of deliberately go down to the bar and order a beer and just sort of sit and listen and try and catch up. And they used to call me El Inglés because they couldn't figure out where Wales was. And so I just after a while I had thought, you got to get over that being labeled English. But I tried my best. And I just picked it up. I mean, it was obviously an extension of French. I never really sat down and tried to learn Spanish deliberately, but it just sort of came really. And it wasn't, I can't say it was tough. I do remember going into the supermarket and thinking, right, I don't know what the names of any foods are. And then I kind of came across a tin of tuna, which in Spanish letters just jumbled up. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense to me. I don't know why. I just knew that atún was tuna, and that was fine. But because there still are fruit and veg guys in Spain and like supermarkets elsewhere. I was sort of pointing and I was going, seis, bananas. And I thought, brilliant, I'm on safe ground with bananas because that's got to be a Spanish word. And the guy was going, plátanos. And I'm going, no, bananas. And I'm pointing at them. They're fucking there in front of you. And then after sort of 5 minutes of this, he sort of looks at me and he goes, in Spanish, banana is plátano. And I was going, then seis plátanos, please. So, yeah. So yeah, it didn't feel like a hard thing to do, I must admit. It was a relatively easy time. I think it's pretty much harder now because industries like English language teaching have changed and there's much more bilingual education. And so a lot of those kind of opportunities, I think, are no longer there. So I think it was a relatively good time to arrive.
I was thinking about learning languages. You read a lot about the fact that AI can translate everything these days, and yet Duolingo seems to be boom, and everybody wants to learn language. You say that it's not quite the same at the moment, but do you think people still, should they go and learn languages, or is that going to become less and less as time goes on with technology?
Yeah, I think both is probably the answer to your question. On the first point, I think it's enriching culturally, right? You can do an awful lot of stuff with AI or just, Google Translate or whatever at a very transactional level, right? So you can, if you need to, and we've done this, we've traveled, around the world. We've been in Myanmar, we've been in Japan, and so on. And as much as you can have a, a gift for kind of modern European languages, Japanese and Burmese doesn't quite, it's a bit harder. So it's quite useful to translate over a thing. Go, oh, okay, toilet this way. Um, but I think it stays then at the transactional level, right? And so you're really talking um, about getting stuff done, booking a hotel, getting a meal or whatever, but you don't get to the deeper interactional level and therefore um, speak to people on, my girlfriend talks about meet people where they are, right? She works for a charity that called the Wellbeing Project, and so she talks about meet people where they are. So if you can speak their language, you can meet them halfway, and then it's a much more enriching experience if you can do that. On the one hand, on the other hand, there are just some things which don't need to be, that are very much transactional, and AI is pretty good at doing stuff like that, I think. Well, I think the other thing is, if you look at the difference maybe between this kind of procedural type of language and literature, you wouldn't want an AI translating a book, for example, because whilst it would do a pretty good job in translating the words, I don't think we're at the position yet. I might be wrong, by the way, because it's not my area of expertise, but I don't think AI can today or and the poetic depth that the original author intended. And I think that's the skill of a kind of professional translator. And I know that a ChatGPT has written books and things, but I think from what I've heard, they're a little clunky.
So jumping to something else you've done, co-founded a theatre company.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, again, it was just a sort of really simple change. It seems quite big looking back. I was working on a summer school, and I was the assistant director to the director, and she and I were quite efficient in getting stuff done. Right, she's fantastically driven person. We basically organized everything in a couple of days, and then we sort of let the rest of the camp kind of carry on. And every now and then I'd go, well, where's Sue gone? Where's Sue gone? And she'd be somewhere working out or dancing. And after a while, I don't know, I really can't remember exactly how it happened, but we said, wouldn't it be good if we could teach these kids English through the medium of singing, dancing, and acting? And we spent pretty much the rest of the camp writing the business plan, syllabus, and pulling it together, and then proposing it to someone, and then away we went. And we did that. It lasted for 10 years in total, which was quite a success. In the end, I think we simply because, well, Sue had moved back to the UK, and I was starting my career in PBSA, and I was doing my MBA at the same time, and so it was just a question of too many things, and so something had to give, and that was it. But yeah, so that was the idea. Then every 2 years or every year, we took the group of kids who were between 5 and 18. There weren't many 18-year-olds, but they were mostly 5 to 16, and it was somewhere between 50 and 80 at any given time, kind of extracurricular activity for them. And we took them to on tour. So every 2 years we would have a national tour. Sounds very grand, but basically means and then interspersed there, we would organize to go to the Edinburgh Festival. And so they would have that whole experience of going to Edinburgh during the festival, which is an incredible experience in itself, but also getting to perform at the Edinburgh Festival, which is pretty special. And yeah, it was great. It was good. We did musicals with kids, and it was a lot of fun. A lot of hard work. That was hard work, I must admit.
So you describe it at the start as, well, it wasn't that hard, and then when you talk about it, it sounds like it was incredibly complex.
It was, but there were two of us at the core of doing it, right? It wasn't just me, and I think it was that partnership, and we had other collaborators that were with us for different periods of time, but the core of it was and that collaboration was very fruitful, and I think it was, yeah, something that you do on your own as a second job, which is what it was. It was every Friday night and every Saturday morning for 10 years. It was,
wow.
But yeah, you get a lot out of it. And I suppose if I look now, again, to the earlier kind of point about the link between the different things, there's always been a link of, teaching in some way, right? Teaching, working with groups of people, and then I suppose in the business sense, I do less teaching, but I probably do a lot of coaching, if that makes sense. It's not always formalized, but I do spend a lot of time with my team and colleagues, and hope they get something out of it.
So you talked about, you saw yourself as you wanted to be a university professor. You are a university professor.
I'm a fake university professor. I'm an adjunct. That is true. I am an adjunct professor. Yes. I teach, well, I've been teaching one course for the last couple of years, and I'm doing one this year as well. But when I say university, I mean like a proper academic, with all this stuff. It is one of the things I enjoy very much doing. Again, it's a second job, but yeah, it's great. And it's nice to have that affiliation and to be engaged with the university. I teach courses on at the moment ships, and I will be teaching a specialist course, albeit very short, on student housing.
Okay, yeah.
In February, I think, the dates, and I'll be tutoring the group for their final thesis project as well. So that's an interesting development for this year. So, but yeah, no, I think it was more the sort of full-time work. Well, perhaps not full-time, but going and being, I don't know, there's something romantic, I think, about that. But yeah, it's for a little bit down the line.
That's quite interesting. So what are you going to teach them about student housing, and I guess who is that? What is that cohort? What are they studying, and who is that aimed at?
Yes, it's a cohort of students on a master's in real estate development. This is a module which is called real estate products, various industry. I'll struggle to say experts here. I'm sure the others are. I don't want to put myself in that bracket, but let me say, through longevity, I'll wear that badge for a moment. So they have a couple up on Resi, couple on, and then they've kind of gone, oh, there's this new thing called student housing. I'm doing that part. What am I going to teach them? We are figuring that out right now between the different professors and so on, because we're looking at what are the kind of different elements that you want to kind of raise. I suspect it's going to be very focused on the operational intention compared to offices, for example, or perhaps the way the industry is structured, how it's financed, and where those might be different from traditional bricks and mortar or industrial sheds, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm figuring that out right now.
I've not heard of that being done in any other universities, so it'll be interesting to see.
There aren't many master's programs on real estate development. I know of one in Switzerland, which is more valuation based, but no, there aren't many. No. So it's quite unique in that sense.
So I'm going to talk about books next in different ways. So you have two independent bookshops.
Yeah.
Why? My question.
So the so on pretty much our first date, my girlfriend and I went to a restaurant, and we said, "Oh, wouldn't it be good if we lived in a mill, had a Range Rover, and ran a bookshop, right?" And that was like 15 years ago. And it was one of those sort of stupid conversations you have when you've just met someone and you're kind of like in love or starting to fall in love, and and I think honestly we still like the idea of living in a mill. We haven't got a mill yet. We haven't got a Range Rover either, just to be clear, but we do have a Land Rover, so we're almost there. And then a few years ago, it was around 2017. A friend of mine said, "Oh, the French bookshop in Madrid is up for sale because the people are moving back to France or whatever it was." And I thought, "Oh, wow, is this an opportunity to get 2 out of 3?" Right? I already had the Land Rover. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying. And so we went and we looked at this little French bookshop, and we kind of sort of, we looked at the business plan, we looked at the numbers. It was a nice little business, honestly. It was, but I was kind of thinking, yeah, but like it doesn't make enough money to kind of not retire, but stop working in student housing, etc., etc. So, and also it wasn't in our neighborhood; it was in a completely different part of it, and also it was just French books, and we were like, well, that's a bit weird. I mean, I speak French, and my girlfriend's Swiss, so Swiss Italian. It wasn't, there wasn't enough of an emotional connection. And as we were kind of coming back into town, we said, it's a shame it's not Cervantes and Company, which was around the corner from our house, because we'd definitely go for it if it was that. And 24 hours later, we get a phone call from a friend of ours saying, just had this really weird conversation offering me to buy a bookshop. And we were like, really? We've just done the same thing in the French bookshop. And she said, oh, no, this is not the French one. This is the one around the corner from your house. I'm like, what? So we went and four partners. We each have sort of different skill sets. Again, I think that's what makes it work. So one of my partners is editor, translator by training, and has worked in publishing for the last sort of 10, probably more years. And the other one is a writer and has worked and run bookshops in the past. And then I do the kind of boring bits, and then and my girlfriend does the kind of events management stuff. So that's how we kind of complemented each other in terms of skill set. And like I said earlier, with the theatre company, these things you need those complementary skills to make the whole thing come together. So it happened pretty quickly. And then the second one came about because we sell a bookshop to a PR company whose founder, who quite tragically passed away at the end of last year, which was very, very sad. He had this vision for his business where he wanted to have an office, but he wanted to then have kind of like spin-off offices in bookshops, because he thought that from a creative perspective, it was good for his teams to be able to kind of be in that environment. And so he I believe he had one in Barcelona, and then he did that with us in Madrid. And he was from the sort of north of Spain in a town called Ponferrada, and he wanted to do something similar there. And what we did was we did the opposite. He couldn't find a bookshop to put his office in, so he built an office and then asked us to build the bookshop around the office. And so we did that, and it's still going, which is a great, and I think in terms of business success, if a bookshop is still going, that is success, right? The numbers are tiny, smaller, and so just keeping going is a big tick in the box. It's not. In real estate, you're talking millions and billions, and in a bookshop, you're really talking about, can we afford to spend 24 pence on a bar of soap? That's the difference. It's fun though.
So when we were researching the episode, you said something, in spite always having worked in the private sector, you're deeply passionate about the role of the public sector in our world. And I wondered what you meant by that.
What I mean is that I think the public sector has, I think, the public sector has a lot to offer. And I think the public sector has a lot to offer, and in terms of providing the basic services for all humans to enjoy. And I kind of see it in a sort of Maslowian way, right? So you've got this sort of pyramid of needs and things, and I think it's up to governments broadly to provide those basic minimum things so that all humans have the same opportunities going forward. And the structure of how we build the society says something about us as human beings and our deeper values. And I suppose as you work more internationally, you see the quite stark differences between countries and how they behave from a public perspective. And that sort of tells you something about their underlying values. Those structures of society start to be dictated by large companies, and in particular globalized companies, brands, and investors, which at times is potentially usurping the role of government. And if government and the public sector in general is going to have maintain, in my view, a real moral North Star of what it is that the whole of the society believes in. So in very simple terms, do we believe that health is the point of need for every one of the citizens in our country? Do we believe that education, primary, secondary, tertiary, higher education, or at a reasonable cost, at the point of use for every? That's how I believe we will structurally remove the differences in society. I think it's a really difficult path to tread, and I think what we've seen in recent times perhaps is a minimizing the importance of that role, and we've been putting more attention onto privatization of things, which isn't a bad thing in itself. But when you privatize too much, you can lose what the objective was, right? So if the objective of the kind of a welfare state is not to fix sick people, it's to create healthy people, or to ensure that people are healthy in the first place. When you privatize it in a hospital, it's to fix sick people for money. Now, again, I'm not against the idea of having private healthcare. It's just that it's a complement to the access that everybody, in my view, should have, regardless of where they come from or how much money their demographic background might be. So that's kind of what I mean. And I think when we look at within student housing, because it definitely crosses the boundary between public education provision, in the UK, the vast majorities of higher education institutions are public. That's not necessarily the case in every country, but one of the challenges we get in student housing a lot is about affordability. And my question is, well, is affordability a private sector concern? And I think there are circumstances where you have public-private partnerships. There needs to be a balance there between the public interest, which is why it was created in the first place, and the private reward. And I don't think that balance is always struck. The building that we're sat in at the moment is a public-private partnership. It sits on the university's land, and is owned by GSA and Harrison Street, and it's managed by Yugo. And there are certain factors that have to be provided by us in the public benefit. So, for example, I can see students walking past, going to the library of the Faculty of Education, which is inside this building. And so as part of the construction of this building, we had to build a library for that faculty. So again, looking what is the public purpose of creating this was to create that space for them as well. And that's what happened. But it's not always the case. And I think the public sector needs to be perhaps a little stronger in understanding absolutely what they want to achieve in some cases. So I think I've meandered around that a little bit, but I think
no, you answered my follow-up question when you were talking was about how that applies to student housing. So and I think one step.
But there's a wider.
Sorry, no, go on.
Please. No, but there's a wider question there, which is and it's less relevant in Spain right now, but as you build, particularly on-campus provision. So you look at, there's a lot of it in the UK. I lived in on-campus accommodation, which was university owned and managed then. It's since been knocked down and rebuilt, and I think it's managed by probably by UPP, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. And I understand as an organization, the university has to retrench on its core objectives, which should be education and research, and so on. But if by doing that, and and I repeat, it's not always the case, but it can be the case with the students who would otherwise who can't access that education because they can't afford to live there. Now, again, public concern. In my view, it's a public concern, but it means that we need, the public sector needs to take responsibility for providing that as well, and it's a balance to be struck.
So I guess taking that one step further is that why you're uniquely placed in your role with Yugo in sort of having those discussions in different markets with different universities? Because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and I'm sure you will, but my opinion is, if I think about somebody working for a global real estate manager on behalf of investors and everything else in business development, that traditional view might not be someone that has the passion and the focus and the sort of, private relationships. That seems, I don't even know where I'm going with the question, but what I'm trying to say is that unique in that role from, and I've spent a long time in the industry. Do you get to have your outlook? Does that make sense?
I think I think I'm running out of battery, so just give me one. I'm going to have to take the headphones out. So
that's all right.
Apologies. Give me 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm going to edit that question down as well because I rambled.
Yeah, do you want to just repeat it? Because I was catching every third word, sorry.
No, that's fine. So taking that one step further, I wonder how your attitude towards public and private sector collaboration and, passion for teaching and everything else feeds into, are you unique in your business development officer for Yugo, makes you uniquely placed and kind of have a different outlook to perhaps a typical real estate business, which is what Yugo and GSA and everything else is. Is that, do you think that was part of the reason why you're in the role, because perhaps you offer something different?
That's very flattering to think of it in those terms. So thank you. My mum will be delighted with that. I think so. I hope so in a way, because ultimately what Yugo is trying to do is be more than a kind of traditional property manager, and that's not to put down the role of the traditional property manager, which has we do that. We have to do that, but I think we see it very much as that's the baseline of what we do, and so this connection beyond that with the students, with the universities, and those long-term sort of partnerships and understanding the motivations of public servants, whether with them predominantly teachers in the case of universities, or managers of teaching institutions, entirely different from the way private institutions think. And I think understanding those things probably does help build those relationships stronger. And that affords us then more opportunities on the real estate side, right? We are a real estate business, delighted to be one, but there is a soul to it, I think, that I probably wouldn't find if I were working in offices, right? That I've never been tempted to move into a different asset class, and I'm wondering now whether that's the reason. So that's interesting. Whether I'm completely unique in that space, I'll take it for today, but I don't think so.
So, looking at what you've done so far in your career in student housing and what you hope to go on to do, scrap that. I'm going to ask you a different question. I'll edit that. So one of the questions I always ask towards the end is about what you would change about the world. And I will ask you that question. But I wonder, what would you change about the student housing industry if you had a magic wand?
The flippant answer is I would, and actually, slightly flippant answer is I would, selfish as well. I'd like to see a rebalance between the distribution of who gets paid for what. The property manager absolutely gets the smallest slice of the whole cake, and yet ultimately is responsible for the lives, quite literally, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, and the protection of these assets that can be valued into the hundreds of millions. So I think I understand why it's been structured the way it's structured, but it would be. I think, and we keep trying to push for a more equitable slice, and it is changing, and there are different ways of slicing and dicing that across the world. But that would be one interesting thing. But again, it's a very selfish perspective, that one. I think the other thing, and this is what I think is changing, is that the industry has kind of evolved, right, from broadly pre-2000s being a kind of passive industry, which I kind of characterize as kind of, the guy, and, might turn up once every Tuesday and sweep the floors and so on. And then in the 2000s, roughly, there was this shift into kind of active student property management, which was more, okay, you had an on-site team, they were looking at things like PPM, they were, actively keeping that building up. And then you had this shift, or I think that we're experiencing now, and I think whether it was Student Housing Company at the beginning and now Yugo, and through the next so years in Spain in the middle, is very much driving towards a proactive approach to student property management, which includes really looking at the welfare and well-being of students achieve, and enabling them to do that, enabling them to get exposure to different professional opportunities, which is a key kind of pillar of Yugo. We have currently something
like 27, 28 that live with us. So they're getting work experience while living with us. And I think another thing is the broader well-being piece, which I know is a kind of buzzword in the industry. And I think that those are the characteristics of that proactive type of management. So those things are changing. And as a consequence of that, I think, and that coupled with macroeconomic factors like interest rates rising, yields going, against investors at the moment, we're finding that they're much more central to the whole part of the industry. Whereas before we were very much the tail being wagged by the dog. You get a developer with a book of properties, and they would go to an investor and go, "Which ones do you want?" "Oh, I want that one, that one, that one, and that one." And then at some point, probably a week before the building, did anybody contract with a property manager yet? No. Oh. So, and then they go and find a property manager to come in at the last minute and look at it. But, well, I hadn't designed any of this. I had nothing to do with any of this. You just give me some keys and said, fill the building and off you go. What we're seeing now is completely different. We're actually starting to see investors who have a clear investment strategy to deploy in this business, partnering with the vertically integrated people have done that, sure, but that's never a partnership with a third-party manager, and it's more the strategic nature of it. I build the partnership, decide what the business is going to be. Is it going to be in the affordable space? Is it going to be in the premium space? Is it going to be in the, are we going to be in only key, top 10 university cities, or are we going to go further and then look for product? That's very much a different approach, and that's what we're starting to see now. So, yeah, those are the things I've changed, and the things I'm seeing change right now.
So, we've talked about all the different things you've done: teaching, theatre, else. A silly tweet question, but if you had to if somebody asked, about you, what would you say? Would you say you were a professor, a student housing development officer? How would you describe yourself?
It's a difficult question. It is a difficult question. I do tend to say I work in real estate, because people understand what that means. Outside our industry and outside the kind of narrow confines of real estate, and that's quite easy to forget, by the way. Real estate it's a pretty small world. But we forget because we're quite enclosed in it, and people don't know what it means. So I just say I work in real estate, but that's pretty much how I do it. I probably should go back to that pie that my therapist talks about, and I probably should kind of say, well, I should flex.
So we have come on to quick fire round questions now. So if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
I would have the world think more collectively, in a more collectivist manner, and act accordingly, and be less individualistic.
Okay. And what advice would you give to someone who wants to change the direction but doesn't know where to start?
The best thing that I can think of is start with your passions. If you don't know what you want to do, go and do what you love, and then a job will turn up. So if I were looking to change, and I would probably go and try and work in the wine industry or the ski industry, and then worry about what the job was later. But I'll probably end up being business development anyway. It doesn't matter where I end up. So.
You go back to being a ski instructor, maybe.
That is a pretty good job. I think that was a lot of fun, but not many mountains around here.
And what's going to be your next big change?
So well, that's an interesting one. I never really know, actually, and I was listening to Joe P's fascinating episode. That he was so deliberate about his career, and so kind of like really the best possible sense of that word, and making, you know, really proactive decisions about, I'm going to learn this and then that's going to take me there. I've never done it like that. I've always kind of been offered opportunities, and I don't remember ever saying no. So I think I don't know really what that next change is going to be, because it's not how I've ever done it. Cop out answer, but there you are.
Maybe you'll go and do that PhD that you talked about.
Well, I would actually, that's a good point. I would love to do that.
If you find the time.
And then at some point, but it is, you know, it's 10 years away, I think, at least. I would like to settle into a kind of teaching job at a university, but preferably Tuesday to Thursday, so I can go skiing on the weekends or sailing.
And on your shift, who would it be?
So again, I thought a lot about this one as well, and so many people who I would recommend have already either been on the show or have been recommended by others. So I'm going to try and be a little... one would be John Thornhill from Ask4. It's not strictly real estate, but they're a provider into the real estate industry. And the reason I would say John is I think he's had a very interesting journey as well, non-traditional perhaps, and I think that's really inspiring on the one hand. On the other hand, I think anybody that knows agree, he's just probably one of the best people in the world. He's just lovely and wonderful to be with. So, so John would definitely be up there. The second person would be, again, in the spirit of hopefully something different for you, Anna Lozano. Anna Lozano is an architect. She has designed various student housing buildings that we manage, but not only that, she's sort of pioneering the use of AI in architecture. And she's a very, you know, who lives between Spain, Paris, you know, she's a fascinating person to speak to, and you know, her kids live in Paris, she lives in, so she's a really interesting person, but doing multiple different things in the wider real estate industry, not just in student housing, but, you know, but also pushing the boundaries of people there. And I think that's a really, really fascinating thing to get into with her. But
and thanks. We'll definitely reach out to them and try and get some episodes recorded. Chris, we finally got together and recorded an episode after a few different attempts at getting diaries to line up. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I think everyone, you know, and you were recommended more than once to come on the show. Everyone said that you'd trodden a bit of a different path to a traditional real estate career. And I think talking to you today, that's true, but I can really see how the two worlds sort of collide. And I think having somebody like you in a provider such as big as Yugo, having that influence can only be a good thing. So yeah, thanks very much for talking to me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Gareth. And you know, it is quite humbling to have been, you know, recommended by the people who recommended me. Yeah, well, thank you. Appreciate it.